All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So we're going to kick off tonight. And for those of you who've joined since I last did this, if you want to put in the chat, if you're running for office, what seat you're running for, what you're hoping to learn tonight. If you're not running for office, just let us know why you're here. Happy to have you as well. Appreciate all the candidates and community members that are here tonight. We're going to start off with introductions for myself and the other presenters, and then we'll each run through 15-minute presentations. Make sure to put questions in the chat as we are presenting. And some of my coworkers will be gathering those and at the end moderate a Q&A for all of the presenters. So put them in as you think of them in the chat so you don't forget. And then we'll make sure to get to all your questions and kind of popcorn around myself, Will, and Nick. But to get started off, let's do some introductions. So I'll start off with Nick.
Great, thanks, Zach, and thanks everyone for joining, and thank you all for running. I'm Nick Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast.
And go ahead, Will.
Thanks, Zach. I'm Will Stewart, Executive Director of Stay, Work, Play, New Hampshire. Glad to be here.
Awesome, and I'm Zach Sheehan. I'm the Director of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. I'm going to go ahead and jump in here with my portion of the presentation. And again, we're each going for about 15 minutes. We'll be sharing some slides on screen with you all, and make sure to be putting in your questions into the chat, either to everyone or to Casey and Neil, who can then take them, record them, and then moderate the Q&A at the end. Casey, can I get a thumbs up if this looks good to you? All right, thank you. As I said, from the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project, us, like Nick and Will's organizations, we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization based here in New Hampshire. And we focus on advocating around school funding and property tax equity. And I'll get into that over the course of this presentation. And I hope that you all will be able to kind of get some of the high level pieces of this issue. It's a very complex issue. And as with all the ones that you'll be hearing about tonight, is we're hoping to kind of give a good introduction, get you interested, get you curious, generate some good questions, and then all three of us will be available after the fact. We'll make sure you get our contact information for any follow-up as well. So the three main points that I'm going to be covering here tonight are as follows. One is kind of outlining how the current system that we use to both fund our public schools and how much money we give to our public schools is unconstitutional. The second point being that both taxpayers and students, this is a very linked problem. It's not just the funding or just how we raise the money. Both are are linked in very specific ways that we'll go over here. And both of them are very inequitable, and it's just across the state, it varies wildly how much funding school districts get. And how the tax rates are across the state. And lastly, I'll kind of answer some of the questions that we've heard from the last time we did this webinar, which was, do people really care about this issue? How engaged are they, and what do they think some of the solutions should be? So to start off with some of the pieces around the unconstitutionality of this. Many of you might have heard of some of the Claremont Supreme Court decisions that happened in the 90s. And these really established some of the basis of the work that we're doing now and some of the education advocacy work that has happened over the past few decades, some from some of the folks on the call tonight. But they really outlined two specific pieces, two specific responsibilities of the state of New Hampshire. The first is that there is this duty to pay for the cost of an adequate education for every K through 12 student. The second being that the taxes used must be uniform across the state. And as a quick aside, these two individual pieces are now the backing of two new lawsuits. One, the Conval lawsuit, which at this point is about 3 years old, kind of tackles that first bullet point. The other, the Rand lawsuit that was filed about 2 months ago, tackles the second bullet point here, the way in which that money is raised. And to get even more specific, the Supreme Court rulings on the Claremont decisions, Claremont 2, specify that the taxes used need to be equal in valuation and uniform in rate across the state. And this is really important. We'll kind of dig into this a little bit more, but I just want to provide that backing, the foundation here, that the Supreme Court has ruled unequivocally that the money raised needs to be uniform across the state. So start with the big picture of the issue. This is the revenue for New Hampshire school districts from the 2020-2021 year. It's about $3.5 billion. And what you'll see here, and just as I'll be showing a number of slides and stuff, and we'll be sending all of these slide decks out after the fact as well, both mine and the one Will and Nick will be using. What you see here is that local property taxes make up the vast majority of the amount of revenue for our public education system, 61%. And it's actually 71% if you add on, if you'll see in the bottom portion, there's another 10% that's the same color, that's called swept. And what that is the statewide education property tax. And while it's named a statewide property tax, it currently and for the past 10 years has been raised, retained, and spent locally. That money never goes into the state coffers. So it is effectively just another local property tax. So combined, that's 71% of all the revenue that for our school districts comes from local property tax, which is a massive proportion relative to a lot of other states and a lot of other funding sources. And what you'll see then, and it shouldn't be too much of a surprise, is that reliance on local property taxes to fund our schools is a driving factor in the fact that the property tax is the largest tax relative to revenue in the state by a long shot. And the local school is that dark blue portion at the bottom. And the state school, which is the swept I just mentioned, is that gray part at the top there. And so that drives our intense reliance on local property taxes across the state. And one other piece I want to point out here is the next chart, the next piece over, the BET and the BPT. Those are the two main business taxes for the state. And while they do raise significant revenue, they pale in comparison to the property tax. And yet a lot of conversations in the legislature the past 5 or 6 years specifically focus on addressing or reducing these two taxes. And yet a lot of businesses, especially small businesses, pay property taxes and pay a lot more in property taxes than they do in some of those very business taxes. So I think this is just a helpful representation of how excessively we rely on property taxes to fund both our schools and a lot of other municipal services around the state. And compared to other states, we are at the bottom for how much money. The flip side of this, right, is how much does the state actually provide to our school districts? And we are dead last in terms of how much money the state provides to our local school districts for our public education system. We're second to last if you give the state credit for that statewide education property tax, which, as I mentioned, is a local tax that's raised, retained, and spent locally. And I mean, just our neighbors over in Vermont, over 90% of their funding comes from the state. So just to show you kind of the range here and just how far off we are in terms of how much money the state provides for our funding here. And a lot of times people at this point start asking, well, how do you compare the pieces around the state? How do you look at different school systems? How do you look at Dover versus Manchester versus Littleton versus Berlin, versus Allenstown, and kind of get apples to apples, get an understanding of what the state's providing and what the reliance on local property taxes is. And we use this term, and this is a term, this is a calculation that the state uses to provide funding, which is called equalized value per pupil. And I know I'm going quickly here, so I'll try to make sure to dig into this a little bit. But basically what this is a measure of is how much property value, taxable property value, is behind each student that can be taxed to raise money for their education, since we rely so heavily on local property taxes to fund public education. And to show a really simple example, let's think of two communities, one with an equalized value of $1 million. One with $400,000. So that's how much taxable property they have available to tax for each student's education. And they each need to raise for example, $10,000 to buy some textbooks or computers, community A has a tax rate of $10 per thousand. But with that same tax rate, community B is only going to raise $4,000. So now community B, the community with lower property values on average, needs to increase their tax rate to be 2.5 times that of community A, just to raise the same amount. And this has real life ramifications. I know talking about tax rates sometimes gets a little abstract. So we ran some numbers to talk about actual tax bills. So here are a few communities from the Pemmy-Baker Cooperative School District. And Plymouth is actually where one of the plaintiffs in the new lawsuit against the state is from. And so what you looking at here is 4 of the towns. This isn't all the towns, but a few of the towns that make up that cooperative school district. So they all go to the same high school. Some of them have different elementary schools, but they're all sending their kids to the same exact high school. And what you can see, that equalized value per pupil on the left side, the higher the equalized value per pupil, in general, the lower the tax rate needs to be to provide that funding. And the ramification of that is that on a $300,000 home in each of these communities, people are paying really wildly different tax bills. And so you have a situation where a family in Plymouth is paying more than 4 times the amount as a family in Waterville Valley to send their kid to the same public high school. And again, that money is also being spent in local elementary school, but thinking about access to that cooperative public high school, sitting in the same classes, same services, same opportunities, and the parents are spending dramatically different amounts. And so you have communities with lower property value, are taxing at a higher rate to try to squeeze just as much, if not as much, out of their communities to support the public education system. A lot of communities really do make that sacrifice and continue to raise their taxes, continue to sacrifice to fund their public education system. But it's a rigged game. It's because the state's not providing enough funding that local communities need to resort to really relying as heavily on the local property taxes. And to give you an idea of just how little the state actually sends, here's a few different towns. And so what we have in the light green bar, the lower amount, is the amount of money that the state is sending on average per pupil to each of these communities. And Allenstown, for reference, is just about average. So we have the state sending, for Nashua, about $5,000 per student. Nashua's actually spending over $17,000 per student to educate their students. And this trend is across the board, whether it's communities with higher property values like Hanover, slightly average like Allenstown, slightly below average like Nashua. It doesn't matter. The state is sending such a small amount of money that the bulk of the burden is relying on local property taxes. And I'm going to kind of go quickly through this next section, because I'm running out of time here. But basically what we did is we asked some school districts, okay, could you actually survive on the amount of money that the state said is an adequate education, the $4,000 to $5,000 they send per pupil? So we had Pittsfield do just that a few years ago. They took their budget, which was actually spending almost $18,000 per student, and tried to slash it down to $4,600 per student as a hypothetical exercise. Could they even do it? And the result was all of these cuts. And for the sake of time and sanity, I'm not going to read all of these because there's 3 full pages of cuts here. All transportation, all grounds maintenance. We're down to half a principal, 34.5 paraprofessional positions. This is the 3rd page here. And the result of that was still a budget higher than what the state's adequacy number was. So at the end of the day, they had to slash half of the remaining teachers. You end up with all of those cuts, many of which violate state and federal laws, and 60 students per teacher. It's absurd. It's absurd to think that anyone can educate their students with the amount of money the state sends as adequacy amounts. And the big kicker for me here, to kind of wrap up and head into end here, is people get this. When we explained this basic dichotomy in a poll we ran last November, the amount of money that the state sends, the actual amount of money communities are spending to educate our students, which, by the way, we have a really good education system here in New Hampshire. We do a really good job on average from a lot of metrics. And that is a credit to our public education system, not to how much we're investing at the state level. But when we outline that basic dichotomy there, people wanted a change to a statewide funding source. 61% of people either preferred or strongly preferred changing to a statewide source once they understood just how much the state was shortchanging local communities and the direct impact on that downshifting onto local property taxpayers. And this is something that came up a decent amount the last webinar we did, but just kind of like, how much do people understand this? How much do they care about these issues? Is it top of mind for both voters and candidates? And everyone lives this issue, whether you're a homeowner like myself, but I don't have kids in the public education system, whether you have kids, whether you've had kids. Public schools are really they hold our communities together. And so you're either interacting with the schools, interacting with the kids, interacting as a taxpayer. And so you start to show how the state's lack of funding, their failure to fulfill that constitutional responsibility, really does have a driving force on our property taxes and the amount of funding that our public schools have to educate our students. People want change. And just to kind of pull it back to this piece here again, to remind everyone really where this problem is coming from, it's that 71% of the reliance is on local property taxpayers to fund our school system here in New Hampshire, our public school system, despite the fact that the state has been told, it's in our Constitution, the Supreme Court has upheld that it is the state's fundamental responsibility to provide that and to pay for it in a way that is uniform and equal across the state. And the truth is, it just is not. And the ongoing lawsuits are arguing that, and the kind of decades of a little bit of action, not quite enough action, has shown that. And this really isn't a issue that is solved or not solved and debated at the state level, the state house, state senate, and the governor via the state budget process, which, if those of you are elected, will be kicking off in January of this coming year, in the first year of the biennium. And so I want to just end with this last thought, which is that in New Hampshire, we do have this system where your zip code is a pretty good determinant of the access to education you're going to have, the access to the amount of funding you're going to have, and that it shouldn't be that way, and it doesn't need to be that way. So I'll kick it up, I'll end it there, and hopefully I only talked a little too fast and not like really too fast for everyone. It's hard to get through all that information, but I will kick it on over to Nick.
All right, thank you, Zach. We get presentation pulled up here. So as you mentioned at the outset, I'm Nick Taylor. I am the Executive Director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast. We serve 53 communities in Stratford County, Rockingham County, and Southern Hillsborough County. Although tonight we'll be covering the entire state, because with all you running everywhere, and it really is a statewide issue. There is no one area of the state that is not touched by the housing crisis that we are seeing right now. So as you're turning on WMUR, reading a newspaper, wherever you're looking, I'm sure you're seeing things about housing, whether it's the record high median sales prices, whether it's record low vacancy rates, whether it's businesses struggling to find housing for their workers, or workers struggling to find housing as they're trying to accept a new job. It's really everywhere right now. And it's not just in the news, right? It's actually, the data is really backing that up, that we are facing an unprecedented crisis here on the housing front. So before we jump into some of the charts and graphs and some of the solutions that we're going to talk about, just want to go over a quick couple of terms that folks are likely hearing if they're going out there and knocking doors, or they're hearing about in these news articles about what does all this really mean. So a couple of terms you hear quite a bit: affordable housing, little a affordable housing. That's really housing that's attainable to our workforce. It does not have a legal definition. People are just thinking of what can someone afford. Typically, when we're looking at that, we're thinking about housing where someone is spending no more than 30% of their income on all-in housing costs. So this is utilities, this is rent, this is everything you would pay for as part of your housing costs. capital A, affordable housing, does have legal and policy definitions, both at the federal level and state level. So whether that might be a subsidized housing, it might be income qualified housing, that is some specific project that you're seeing. Workforce housing is a little bit the same way. So a few years ago, New Hampshire passed a workforce housing law. So there actually is a legal definition in New Hampshire state statute that defines workforce housing as rental units that are affordable up to 60% of the area median income, or 100% if it's a for sale unit. And we have workforce housing in our name as our organization. But the reality is we are just focused on housing that's attainable to our workforce. And that, again, if you're at the doors or talking to businesses, they're really talking about it in terms of the people that are behind this, not the actual definition. But certainly if you're getting down into the policy nitty gritty next session, you want to be aware that there is a legal definition in state statute, and we do have a workforce housing law. The final term you may hear as you're talking about housing with developers or constituents or voters is the market rate housing. So market rate housing is housing with no restrictions. It's priced at whatever the market will support. This is, the overwhelming majority of the housing stock in New Hampshire is market rate housing. Market rate housing is not inherently unaffordable. There may be a duplex where you have 2 units in one property that is perfectly attainable and affordable to members of our workforce. It's just market rate at that size, right? And so, like, when we're thinking about what kind of solutions and what we can do about the housing stock, it's not all projects that are below market rate. It's figuring out how can you get things in there that are attainable, that are that work for our workforce. Let's see, there we go. So what is going on? Let's look at some numbers and some charts here. So the first few charts are going to be about single family for purchase housing, and then we'll look at a couple on rental. So this chart right here is showing the median sales price for a single family home in New Hampshire. As you can see, that chart is trending up and to the right at a very high rate. So you're looking at a couple of benchmarks here. Q2 of this year, the statewide median sales price was $455,000. Just 4 years ago in 2018, the same quarter, this median sales price was $289,000. We took 17 years to go from a median sales price of 200 to 300,000. We then went from 300 to 400 in just 2 years. So you're seeing that, obviously some level of growth in median sales price is good. It's the major investment for many families in New Hampshire, but this kind of rapid growth is highly unusual, and it's really pricing a lot of folks out of being able to start that wealth creation process, have a home, have something over their heads that they can purchase. So that was the sales price. This is another metric that we use when we're looking at for sale purchases. And this is months of housing supply on the market. A healthy rate is about 6 months supply. This April, and it has trended up a little bit higher than it is right now, but April 2022, we were at half a month supply. That was creating those situations where you were seeing people with all cash offers, waiving inspections, having housing go for $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 over asking prices, these bidding wars, because the supply was so incredibly low, uncharacteristically low, and unhealthily low from a for sale market. So those two were both some numbers around our, again, the for sale for purchase market. Now a couple numbers around rents. So this chart right here is showing the median gross rent in New Hampshire. And this is from the just released at the beginning of August, the New Hampshire Housing's 2022 residential rental cost survey. So this is really fresh data. That blue line there is all units. The light blue line or the teal line there is 2-bedroom units. So, and the median gross includes your rent costs and your utilities, but it's going up rapidly year over year. In just the last 5 years, the all unit median gross rent has gone up 32%, 26% for the 2-bedroom. So folks who are already facing like really tight family budgets are seeing rent eat up a bigger and bigger piece of that pie. And it's squeezing people out. And part of that is because the vacancy rate is so low. Is that this chart right here is showing what the statewide rental unit vacancy rate is. A healthy, balanced market rate, it should be around 5%. And so we're seeing here with all units, we're at 0.5%, 2 bedrooms, we're at 0.3%. That is incredibly low. Nationwide, it's at 5.8%. Even the rest of New England, where we're seeing a lot of housing troubles, it is still at 4.8%. So we are highly out of the flow here when it comes to the rental vacancy rate. And those low numbers are, again, what's driving the costs up. So even if you can find a place, which is obviously very difficult given the vacancy rate, that doesn't even account for what it's going to cost you, right? And so you have folks who are keeping our economy going, who are the folks we need in our communities, and they can't find a place that's affordable. And so at the outset here, I said we work on the Seacoast, but this is a statewide problem. You can see right here, it's again that same rental vacancy rate broken out by county. No matter whether you're in the Upper Valley or in Cheshire County or on the Seacoast here in Manchester or Nashua, you're struggling to find a place to live if you're looking to rent. And so again, just across the board, we are nowhere near that balanced rental market that would allow for that healthy flow of give or take affordability, people being able to find a place when they get a job and are moving into a community. So that was a bunch of numbers there. What does it all mean? Like, what is the problem? So fundamentally, this is a lack of housing supply. And so that lack of supply with a strong demand has caused prices to go up and up and up. And housing is not a situation where you can just flip a switch and increase supply. It takes years and years to build up that supply and develop it into a way that's going to get back into the economy here. So there's a lot of estimates that have New Hampshire short 20 to 30,000 housing units to both get up to that healthy rate, but also to be able to sustain, the economic growth that we project and that we would need to see to keep our economy flowing there. So that lack of supply is really driving, almost all of the housing challenges here. And so what's stopping that development, right? If we know what the problem is, if it's been a problem for the last few years and it's continuing to accelerate, why aren't we able to solve it? So, in the housing world, we think about the 5 Ls. These are things that are both barriers, but also go into the cost of housing. Like, what is making these costs go up? What is some of the fundamental, instruments that are making this a problem here? So the 5 Ls: labor, land, lending, lumber, and laws. So labor, that's our workforce. That's, you're talking about the construction workers, the plumbers, the electricians, the contractors, the folks in the trades and the apprenticeship programs that, for years as a country and in the state, we've sort of disincentivized people to get into that workforce. And that's, to a problem, right? And that we need to have the workforce that can be able to build the units and expand on this and keep that labor cost at a healthy level, but at a level that, developers and local builders who are trying to, add an accessory dwelling unit to their backyard don't have to wait months and months and months to find someone who can have some availability to do the work. Land, going into the cost here, the land that we build on, that's a major factor in your costs. So, if you're looking at a community and they have 2-acre zoning minimums, your land right off the bat is going to make that house unaffordable, right? And so you're thinking about when costs are going up, it's in many cases on single family lots, it's because some of the zoning has only allowed for large plots of land that you're not going to be able to develop anything that's affordable or a starter home or a home for someone to downsize with some of these big, minimums that really only incentivize those larger single family homes. Lending, access to capital. If you're a nonprofit developer, if you're a developer who's trying to build some below market rate units, there are a lot of programs that allow you to make those budgets work, whether it's tax credits, whether it's the Affordable Housing Fund. Finding access to capital is incredibly important for the development of affordable and workforce housing units. Lumber, these are your material costs. As we know from anyone who goes shopping or any of the stuff that they've seen recently, costs continue to go up. But the lumber costs have gone up enormously year over year here. And that's also contributing to the increase in costs and slowing down of development. And then finally, the biggest one here is the laws, zoning and regulation. So many of our current zoning laws and land use laws incentivize these expensive single family homes, prevent affordable housing options, prevent multifamily options. And so when we look about what we can do and what we can control in New Hampshire, increasing access to capital, looking at those laws, looking at the workforce to some extent is the biggest kind of buckets that we can tackle, potentially at the state level and locally. So how do we increase that housing stock? Kind of the inverse of what I was talking about with some of the challenges there. Looking at some of the zoning reform, some of this missing middle infill housing that many folks love, that already exist in a lot of our communities, but have been zoned out of being allowed to develop more, or we've put in restrictions to say, yeah, you can't do that with your property. So this is your ADUs, this is your in-law apartments, this is duplexes. This is figuring out how do we get some more units onto some of these plots of land that already exist, and again, that have the capacity to do it, have the space to do it. Some other zoning and regulatory reform pieces here on parking requirements, lot minimums. I touched on the multi-acre lot sizes. Again, you're not gonna be able to get anything affordable if it's a single family only 2-acre zone. Increasing access to capital. A lot of really great programs in New Hampshire here, whether it's the low income housing tax credits, the Affordable Housing Fund, the Community Development Finance Authority has a great tax credit program, but all these, could be increased. They could be allowed, doubled. They could be tripled. They could be setting the stage for, increased development that allows developers who are looking to make build some of those below market rate units more possible, more financially feasible, because at the end of the day, they need to be able to make the math work themselves too. 2 more things around how we can increase housing stock. Regulatory reform. A couple of years ago, the legislature passed and the governor signed the Housing Appeals Board. This was able to help move things forward at a faster rate. So we're not sitting 5, 6, 7 years to get something developed. These processes need to move quicker. And a lot of that comes in regulatory reform and protecting some of the gains we've made, and also figuring out how we can expand on them. And then finally, investments in water and sewer infrastructure. The infrastructure piece allows for increased density, right? And not every community will have public water and sewer. It's not, it will never happen in New Hampshire, and nor should it. There's a lot of great rural communities that, will never get water and sewer. But figuring out what certain communities can do, whether it's a community that wants to expand, that's at its capacity, what can we do to increase that? Everyone here is running for office. So I think folks like to know that what they're talking about is a key issue and is important. On the housing front, it absolutely is. So earlier this year, the St. A's Center for Ethics and Society went out in the field, did a poll here. 69% of residents agreed with the statement, my community needs more affordable housing to be built. By a 50 to 43 margin, said they were okay with it in their neighborhood. So people want this, they want action taken. And the Granite State poll, which is run by the University of New Hampshire, housing earlier this year trailed only jobs in the economy as the most important issues facing New Hampshire. So people are seeing it, they want action, they want steps to be taken. But when you're out there, you'll still hear some myths, right? My taxes will go up. This is only a city problem. On the taxes front, there's been a lot of research done here in New Hampshire by New Hampshire Housing and others. Single family housing has the lowest value per acre out there. So we're talking about building broad tax bases for our communities. Multifamily, mixed use, commercial, all have a higher value per acre. So if you're thinking about those housing options, multifamily, mixed use actually get communities a bigger bang for their buck. And students, as Zach just talked about, probably property taxes might not be the best way to fund education. But when we're talking about it in the housing context, people are always worried, oh, if you build an apartment complex, you'll get 5 more students. We can't afford that. That'll cost us, $100,000 in new taxes. Well, the reality is when you're thinking about housing, and you're thinking about adding students, we have declining enrollment in many of our communities. And so the building stays the same. The utility costs are still there. The staff costs are still there. So when you're adding apartments and adding kids into your communities, you really need to be thinking about the marginal cost and not the average cost of each student. And then finally, on the city problem, all of our communities need teachers, firefighters, police officers, local businesses, DPW workers. And as we saw, this is not just a city issue. It's not going to be solved by just cities. It's not going to be solved by just certain areas of the state. So all communities can do something, whether you're on water and septic and it's accessory dwelling units, or whether you're able to have bigger developments. Every community can do something, and we all need to be part of the solution going forward. So thank you all. Again, thank you for running. There's some contact information there. Looking forward to answering some questions later on.
All right, I believe that means it is over to me. So give me one moment. Let me share my screen here. All right, here we go. So again, my name is Will Stewart, and I'm the Executive Director of Stay, Work, Play New Hampshire. And we are a statewide nonprofit whose mission is to attract and retain more young people here in the Granite State. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges to doing that and some of the pluses that make it a little bit easier, maybe some things that we can focus on. But first, I want to give you a little bit of background and context to show you why, to talk a little bit about why it's important to attract and retain more young people here. First and foremost, New Hampshire is the second oldest state in the country by average age. We're second only to Maine. We're tied with Vermont as being the second oldest state in the country. So we have a northern New England challenge here. But here in New Hampshire, we have kind of some exacerbating circumstances that are make it even more of a challenge for us. For one, our employment rate is super low. You've probably seen the headlines and the jobless unemployment rates that have come out, and this is true even before COVID. We had very low unemployment, which is good on one hand, but a challenge for employers who are seeking employees. And now, I think even pre-COVID, we were maybe 2.5%. Now we're down at 2%, one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country. And then finally, kind of creating that perfect storm is that New Hampshire is the #1 exporter of high school graduates who are pursuing a bachelor's degree. So nearly 2 out of 3, 63% are leaving the state to pursue that 4-year degree. Some of them come back, but a lot of them don't. Now, one of the reasons that a lot of young people do leave the state to pursue that bachelor's degree is the high cost of higher education here in New Hampshire. Similar to what Zach said, about the state being dead last in per pupil funding at the K-12 level. The same is true at the higher education level. New Hampshire is 50th in per capita funding. I like to joke, that it's not often I aim for mediocrity, but wouldn't it be great if we were number 25? But the end result, no joke, is that we have the highest average student debt load in the country, as you can see right here. That's the average. A lot of students, half the students are coming out with even more of that. So huge challenge here. Now, of course, I'd probably be remiss if I didn't mention a little bit about the college debt, student debt forgiveness, that's come out. And while Stay Work Play doesn't have any official position on that, we traditionally focus on state level issues, not federal. I will say, in talking with young people around the state in the past week or so, there is a tremendous kind of sigh of relief that we're hearing from young people. Because again, the more people, and this is hundreds of dollars a month, that so many students and young people are faced with that burden here in New Hampshire, that being able to cut off $10,000 means more that they can put toward that increasing rent that Nick was talking about. The more they can save up to maybe put down a down payment on a starter home, the more they can put toward a car payment, which they need here in New Hampshire. So it will definitely help make it a little bit easier for young people to live here in New Hampshire. So I also want to talk a little bit about some of the myths and the facts as they relate to young people in New Hampshire. And I think, like all generations, we seem to, each member of each generation, I think, has certain preconceptions, assumptions, that we look at when we think about other generations. And I can tell you some of the things that I hear in my role, from people not in, kind of the millennial or Gen Z generation, is that, all young people today, always start out, all young people today, want to live in a metropolitan area. They all want to live in, urban loft apartments. They all want to take Ubers around. And don't get me wrong, like, this stuff is cool, and it definitely appeals to a certain segment. I would say not just in the younger demographic, but this is certainly not representative of all millennials and all Gen Z. And I think that if it were, New Hampshire, we wouldn't have very much luck at all. Thankfully, it's not. Like every generation, there are different people who want different things. Some want an urban experience, some want a very rural experience, some want a suburban experience. So just keep in mind that like every generation, nobody wants the exact same thing. So what do young people want? This is something that is paramount to our mission, Stay Work Play, to attract and retain young people. We hear a lot anecdotally But we decided, a few years ago that we needed to actually get some really hard data. We're a small nonprofit. Yes, we are statewide, but we're a full-time staff of 3 with a budget of $200,000, entirely funded by the private sector. So we recognize that if we're going to have a prayer of moving the needle on attracting and retaining young people, we need data. And so we conducted a survey to look at what young people want, what makes them stay, what makes them leave. So I'm going to share a little bit about that with you tonight. And also as a preface, we'll share some of the demographic information that we gathered from that too. The first of which, as you see here, that half of respondents, and these were people between the ages of 20 and 40, currently living in New Hampshire. Half said they were born here, so half were not, or not native to the Granite State. We've talked a lot about housing, and let's dig a little bit deeper into the living situation of young people. 58% responded that they live with a spouse or a partner. 14% said they lived alone. 7% said they lived with friends or roommates, while 21%, 1 in 5, said they lived at home, either with parents or other family members. 1 in 5, 21%. So, we asked, of those 21% who live with parents or other family members, 57% said they don't pay rent. Now, this is probably what I consider the most depressing slide that you'll certainly see in my presentation tonight, I think. We asked, how many friends, live, basically, how many friends do you have that live in physical close proximity to you? Or how many friends do you have in that area? We didn't ask you a certain mileage area, but just that you would consider close or easily accessible. 21%, again, 1 in 5, said they didn't have a single friend nearby. Now, this is depressing, on an individual level. It's sad if somebody doesn't have friends, but also think about it from an employee retention standpoint, or as a community retaining young people there. If people in your organization, if people in your town don't have friends, they're probably not likely to stick around very long. The job they have might just be a job. And if they're offered another one that offers to pay them more money, advance their career, or take them back to where their friends and family are, I think they're that much more likely to go. And so we also asked, how likely is it that you would consider moving out of New Hampshire within the next 2 years? And again, talk about a slide that kind of keeps me up at night. This is another one of those where we said that if you look at it and add them up, either about 30% say they either probably would or definitely would. 1 in 3 approximately are saying, if I'm a betting man, and I kind of have to be, that in the next 24 months, they're gone. 30%, 1 in 3. So why? Why are young people saying they might consider leaving New Hampshire? The biggest response we got was jobs and career opportunities. And really the focus, when we dug down on this, doing some follow-up kind of focus groups, it was really, particularly the farther north and west you go in the state, we heard this more and more. Just to give an example, we were up in the Mount Washington Valley, talked to a young woman who was in advertising. And I think she worked in one of the only advertising firms, in the Mount Washington Valley and that point north, and said, she basically said, look, if I want to continue in this field, and I do, I'm either going to have to move, I'm going to have to move south, either into southern New Hampshire or into Massachusetts or beyond, to advance my career. So jobs and careers opportunities, number 1. Housing, a very, very close number 2. And again, this is only been exacerbated, in the pandemic times, as both rents and home prices, as Nick talked about, have continued to increase. And then, third, kind of rounding out the top issues of why young people leave New Hampshire or say they will, lack of friends, lack of connections. Again, 1 in 5 saying they don't have a single friend nearby. These are big, big challenges. There are others that came across in this survey, and I'm happy to share the actual data. We have lots of good crosstabs for anybody who really likes to delve deep into data, happy to share. But the other reasons, kind of rounding out why young people say they might leave New Hampshire, it's lack of diversity, for one. lack of public transportation, lack of accessible and affordable childcare, and a lack of nightlife opportunities. So I don't want to leave you with everybody being depressed and there's nothing we can do, and New Hampshire has nothing going for it. That's definitely not the case. And I'm happy to report also that in recent years we are seeing a net in-migration of young people in New Hampshire. It's very, very modest. I mean, we're talking like in the 3,500, 4,500 people per year net in migration, but it's better than the out-migration that we saw really up until that 2015-ish time frame. And why are young people coming here? Why are they staying? The reasons that we got, again, these are the kind of the top answers here. And as you can see, kind of from the photos, it's really everything, the environment and everything the outdoors. From our world-class recreational amenities, our mountains, lakes, our seacoast, the proximity of the state and local parks that we have. And the environment itself, just kind of the clean environment was cited as a big reason, to stay here in New Hampshire. That's not all, as was mentioned by Zach. The schools here in New Hampshire, both K-12 and higher education, were cited as being, as Zach mentioned, really stellar on average. On the whole, very good schools. That young people and parents and those who are considering becoming parents really do take into consideration. Other things mentioned, kind of a close-knit sense of community in a lot of the towns and neighborhoods here in New Hampshire. Low crime, safety was a big plus, as was the preponderance of locally owned stores and restaurants. They really like that, that community feel that you get in New Hampshire towns all the way around. So, what do we do with this information? Here at Stay Work Play, for those of you who will be elected this November, I'll likely be coming in front of some of your committees, depending on which ones you're on, to talk about these issues and how they relate, to the attraction and retention of young people, and things that we can do, that you can do as policymakers to help that. The biggest, as you can see by the size of the top icon there, is housing affordability. For the past 2 years, and I should say, preface that Stay Work Play does nonpartisan issues-based advocacy. You're really based on the data that we collected in that survey I just mentioned, as well as those focus groups where we like to go around the state, usually every couple of years, and talk to young people about the issues in their particular regions. But housing affordability, the #1 issue that we hear from young people, and it's just gotten louder these past couple of years. And in fact, of the past couple of years, we've probably taken positions on about a dozen-ish bills. And in the past 2 legislative sessions, more than half have related to housing, which just underscores just how big of a deal this is. And Nick, gave some great, examples of things that can be done, to address those. You'll also see us up there on childcare, education debt and student debt, outdoor recreation, and diversity, equity, inclusion. These are our, really our 5 policy priorities, through which we view all of the legislation that you'll be filing, that you'll be debating, and ultimately that you'll be voting upon. And to the extent that you ever have any questions about, how any of these bills might relate to the attraction and retention of young people, I would certainly, love to talk to you about that in more detail. So with that, I will conclude the presentation. I think now we are going to get into some question and answer time.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Will, and thank you, Zach and Nick, for your great presentations. I'm just going to quickly spotlight the 3 of you again, and then we'll go ahead and get into Q&A. So I wanted to start with Senator Waters' question, which was for Nick, but I think could also be beneficial for all of the panelists to think about. So specifically for Nick, with the 5 Ls, which is the biggest factor and which ones can we do something about legislatively? And while Nick is answering that, Will and Zach, if you want to think about what you'd like to share about your hopes as far as legislative priorities for the session goes, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Casey, and thanks, Senator Waters, for the question. It is a great one. I mean, there are so many things that go into housing that we can't really control legislatively. And so, and too often housing decisions are made on like one-off projects that are being debated at the local level. So what I like to think about is what can we do that is, creates the environment and the systemic ability for housing to move forward. So on the lending piece, there's really two buckets. There's the land use and there's the lending. The lending piece, expanding some of these programs, like whether it's the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, whether it's expanding some of the Community Development Finance Authority's tax credit programs, those make a huge difference for developers who are looking for being able to do some below market rate units and being able to finance those in a way that makes sense. I mean, you look at some great success stories in Portsmouth. The Portsmouth Housing Authority just finished the Ruth Lewin Griffin building. That is a phenomenal project. It's all workforce housing units, about 60 units. They had almost 400 applicants for that. So there was clearly an immense demand. You also heard about people that had worked for the city of Portsmouth for 20 years who could finally afford to live there. So, right, like those were the type of stories. And that, so that's like a budget solution. And so thinking about some of those programs probably would be through the budget process, or at least something that would go through the finance committee. And then you have the land use solutions. The land use solutions being able to create, the process for things to move forward without getting a bunch of variances, without running into challenges around what you can and can't do within reason. Certainly there's a purpose and a great place for zoning. That's not, we're not anti-zoning, but things like, we supported Representative Ivy Van's bill last session that allowed for communities that had water and sewer to be able to build up to 3 or 4 units, I forget which one, on their property. So if they had a house that they wanted to convert into a duplex, they could do that without running through a bunch of variances and projects. So there are different things you could do, but really it's that land use piece to create the environment for infill to move forward, and the funding piece for projects that are larger developments to be able to move forward financially.
Only thing I might add too would be on the maybe the regulatory piece with regard to the Housing Appeals Board. This is something that Stay Workplace supported the creation of and has had to defend along with a number of other housing advocates the past session or two. It seems like there are always several bills filed to both either eliminate it outright or reduce its capacity. And I can, if anyone wants to know more, I'm sure Nick can talk about the ins and outs of it. But definitely would like to see that Housing Appeals Board, stay as is.
That's a great point. Well, I was thinking offensive things, but absolutely, that was a big win, and it's made a big impact. And we've heard that people are using it, and it is moving forward. And 90-day appeals, like that was a big deal for things that used to take 3-4 years. So yeah, we definitely got to defend that one.
And a few, to kind of answer the similar question, less targeted to housing. A few things that we're hoping this legislative session will be a more productive conversation around. One thing is there's program called the Fiscal Capacity Disparity Aid, which was a piece of the education funding. It's actually removed in the last budget, but it targeted towns that had lower property values, and so it was really kind of an equity-minded funding solution to try to identify the communities that had less property values and less ability to raise money to help give them targeted aid. And that going away the last budget cycle was pretty detrimental to a lot of the communities that relied on that. So revisiting that and putting some more money in there, kind of as a band-aid in the sense of it's super helpful for communities that have it. It does not address kind of the systemic issue that we've been talking about tonight. There are other property tax relief programs that have not been funded as much as they could have been, that we could be looking at in the session. And then kind of the big piece, and we recognize this as an organization that we're both trying to provide some kind of concrete solutions, concrete specific short-term things while pushing for long-term large-scale reform. And so part of the conversations that happened around the Commission to Study School funding a few years ago, and we're hoping to kind of keep that going this year, is some honest conversations around how much the state should be spending. And with that comes, how do you raise that money? And looking at different types of statewide property taxes, looking at different types of, we've repealed and reduced business taxes in the past few years. So revisiting those as sources of revenue. We're really trying to look at how we raise money and who is actually paying. And because right now, largely people without the means to pay are paying larger shares of their income. And really working to connect that to education funding. So both a few concrete things and a few kind of higher level policy areas that we hope to kind of drive the conversation forward on this year.
Great. I'm gonna do one for Stay Work Play. You find where I was in my document. And I think Nick might have some insight on this as well. Do you think that the push for internet for all will help retain workers and attract more in the North Country and rural areas?
I do. I think it's critical. It's not I would say it's essential. It's not a feel good. Wouldn't it be nice to do this? I think it really is essential if we want to attract and retain people, particularly in the North Country and in others, other areas less served by broadband. And I would say it's not just for remote work, though I think that will certainly make a lot of those areas more attractive to people, particularly who are inclined and predisposed to want to live, close to those, again, world-class recreational and natural areas that we have here in New Hampshire, who have that ability to work remotely. This will allow them, to do just that and be, you're right, steps from the ski slopes after they, log off of work. But it's also, just regular life stuff. I remember even being, I mentioned these focus groups that we did. We did one in the Upper Valley a few years, right, immediately pre-COVID almost. And I remember, a young woman, she said she and her boyfriend lived like 20 minutes outside of Lebanon. And she's like, we don't, our internet, we don't have strong enough internet to, to even stream, Netflix. And she's like, that's a deal breaker, for me. And this was, again, pre-pandemic, nothing about work, but they just can't like live and do normal day stuff. And so they were like, well, we can't live in this town because we can't get reliable, fast internet. So, we're going to go someplace else that has it. So it's a long way of saying that, yes, internet is critical, to New Hampshire retaining and attracting young people, especially in the more rural, isolated areas.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. I have two questions for you, Zach, that I'm going to try to combine together because they're very closely related. So Sandy Steele in the chat says that she remembered seeing that funding for public ed had recently been changed or will be, and that some towns, the donor towns, will benefit while others might lose out, despite the change being advocated as a tax cut. And Bonnie Wright in the chat mentioned that her district, Salem, is likely to be one of those donor towns and wants to know how to discuss that with her potential constituents who are already panicking about property taxes. So if you could just clarify a little bit about that legislation and then maybe give some helpful tips for navigating those conversations.
Yeah. So first off, there is no such thing as a donor town right now. That was created, is a term that was used to advocate against the statewide education property tax when it was first enacted, I believe in the early 2000s. And it was successfully argued against to the point where we no longer have a statewide education property tax. So there is no longer any community that gives any of their excess swept to the state. So donor towns do not exist right now. But I think that what the question, and to kind of go back to a little bit of what Sandy was saying, is there was a $100 million tax reduction of swept this past year by the state. And this is a little bit confusing because it's not a state tax, but the state sets the rate, and then everyone has to raise that rate, even though they raise it and spend it locally. They just tell the state they raised it, but they spend it locally. The state lowered the amount everyone had to raise this year. The problem is they did that in tandem, so technically it was a tax cut kind of for every property owner. The problem is they did that in tandem with eliminating the fiscal capacity disparity aid. So on the whole, and there's some good resources that broke this down community by community, communities with lower property values got screwed by that because they already had to raise way more than the swept rate anyway. Whereas communities that had higher property values benefited from that and also did not get hurt by not getting the fiscal capacity disparity aid. So it's a little confusing, but frankly, from my perspective, that was $100 million that was used more for a campaign talking point than actual targeted aid, when it could have gone into a program that was already existing that could have helped benefit communities. But so that's not a change that's about to take place. I mean, that was legislation that happened in the last budget, and there'll be some ramifications for that. The largest being those communities that had the fiscal capacity disparity aid or don't see those payments anymore. A little bit, I know it's confusing, but that's kind of the big picture. And just to clarify again, there's no such thing as a donor town right now. That does not happen. And it could, I guess, if we go back to systems that had that, but it has not happened since 2010.
Thanks, Zach. I've got one for Nick from Mandy Krasner, who's running for state rep in Stratford County. Do the local laws discourage multiple family housing because local governments are afraid that housing will bring more students to the schools?
There's a lot of factors in that, and I think it is a myth that we hear quite a bit. And my guess is I covered a little bit of that during that sort of midsection, but just to kind of recap, when we hear that, we obviously are pushing back because there is an education component to all of our policies, but certainly on the housing front, that the reality is, we're talking about the marginal student and not the average student. I think this also dovetails really nicely off of what Zach was talking around the school funding piece of this, because, people think you add another student, that's maybe $17,000 per another student in my class, if that's the average what we spend, but you're really not spending the average when you're adding a student, especially given declining enrollment, because you have the utilities, the building, the staff, a lot of those fixed costs are already built in there. So when you're adding students, you're not really adding, much to your broad-based costs, if at all. But there's certainly, I think, a lot of reasons why some of the zoning that has been put in place over the years has a negative effect on multifamily housing. But the reality is, we have to start to undo that. Part of that was just the glorified idea of a single family home with a white picket fence. And, it was built on a reality that is not what families are, and certainly families are today. And, as houses got kind of bigger and bigger, you saw less of those even smaller single family homes that could be a great starter home for somebody, right? So we think about this in terms of people's housing life cycles, whether it's their first rental unit, their starter home, their home where they raise their kids, or it's a home that they downsize to stay in their community, but when they don't need 5, 6 bedrooms anymore because their kids moved out of the house. And so, that's kind of a long way of saying laws absolutely make a big impact on the local level with zoning. There's a lot of reasons why things got put in places, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done to kind of pare that back, both at the local and state level, so that we can build diverse housing options that allow for people to stay in their communities, to be here and be in the communities that we love.
Thanks, Nick. I have a question for Will. Do other New England states retain young people better than New Hampshire does? And do we have any insight into what they're doing that we're not?
So it's certainly, in some cases, it's an issue of apples versus oranges. I think in the I would divide New England for this conversation into northern New England and southern New England. I mentioned that Maine being the #1 exporter, or oldest average age, and then New Hampshire and Vermont tied for #2. These 3 states are certainly more rural and have a much less much smaller population than Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. So I will say that of the northern New England states, we're far and away the leader with net in-migration. And in fact, in recent years, New Hampshire has led as a percentage, the other New England states. I take out, I would reclassify the southern New England states, because they have, their job engine, centers are much greater. Massachusetts, in particular, with its, higher education concentration there, certainly is kind of in a league of its own. But with regard to what can be done differently, taking into these differences into account, One thing I will say is that in a lot of states, what Stay Work Play does, marketing and branding the state as a place of opportunity, for example, which is kind of our bread and butter, would be done and is done, by a state economic development entity. In New Hampshire, that just doesn't exist, and that's why Stay Work Play exists. We work closely with folks in state government, particularly at the Division of Economic Development at the Business and Economic Affairs Department. But like a lot of other New Hampshire departments, they are just woefully underfunded for the tasks that they've been given. And so we try to assist, and again, the private sector has stepped up and funds us. But I think to the extent that the state can really invest some dollars in this, it could really yield some results. But it just hasn't been the case. Kind of the New Hampshire way, sometimes being penny wise, pound foolish.
Thanks, Will. Zach, I have a question for you. There's been a lot of talk, especially with back to school, about the teacher shortage in New Hampshire and across the country. Can you talk a little bit about how the inequities in our current system affect teacher employment and pay?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to talk specifically about pay, which is some of the data, or like general data that I have off the top of my head. Reaching Higher New Hampshire, actually, and Sandy, I saw your question in the chat. There is a really good analysis that Reaching Higher New Hampshire, which is another great nonprofit here that does education policy, did a good analysis about that swept cut. So we can send that in the stuff after the fact. I think, no, just put it in the chat. Relative to teacher pay, they also did an analysis about a year ago, and I think they're coming out with an updated one this fall. They just asked, teachers with the same amount of experience, same level of education. So teachers with a master's, teachers with a bachelor's, same number of years in the classroom. What were the starting pays at different school districts around the state? And they were all over the place. And some of them, collective bargaining agreements with unions impact that to some degree. But what you did see was a trend where schools that had, on average, access to more property value and had more funding because of that higher property value, were able to offer their teachers more. And you can't blame someone in any profession for doing the same job, and maybe going 10 miles over to the next town and taking a 20-30% pay increase because that school has just that much more resources to pay them. And so there are dramatic disparities just from a starting pay perspective, because once you kind of get into different pay schedules for different districts, it becomes more of an apples to oranges. But just that starting pay, there is pretty dramatic disparities relative to different school districts. And we're looking at putting out some reports, hopefully later in the year, that do look at how tight the correlation is to equalized value per pupil and property values. But at first glance, it seems to be pretty correlated.
Great, thanks, Zach. Nick, what are some of the short-term solutions that could lead to a larger, more affordable supply of workforce housing?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the challenges around housing is that we know we need more supply, but it's not something we can just kind of turn on and immediately build or flip a switch and increase that supply. So when we're talking about the short-term solutions, there really aren't a ton of short-term, silver bullet solutions. And so the key thing is creating an atmosphere where there's some predictability, where there's some resources, where there's this environment that we can add housing units in different communities. If you're a rural community, that you can do something with your ADU, your in-law suite ordinances, or whether it's manufactured housing, or whether it's bigger developments in some of our cities with more public infrastructure. You really have to be able to create that environment, things like the Housing Appeals Board, things like regulatory limits that require decisions to be made in certain levels of time. So again, we're not stretching things out years and years and years, that we're actually moving things forward. So, it is a challenge. It's a real challenge for you all when you're in the state house and trying to tackle this, because it is not something that you pass something and you'll see a change that next year or that next election cycle. It is a long-term thing. And it took us decades to get here. It's going to take us a long time to kind of dig ourselves out of that.
Thanks, Nick. Zach, I just saw your message. So I have a question from Jay from early on in the webinar. New Hampshire being the second oldest state, like Will was mentioning, is reflected in the state legislature, and public education is not necessarily a priority for an aging population. What else can be done other than push to get more young people in elected office to address this issue?
Yeah, so I'll answer a piece of that, and then I'd be interested in hearing Will's thoughts on how to get more young people in elected positions, because that's definitely a lot more of his wheelhouse. But this comes up a lot, and actually, I saw that asked in the chat, and I went and found our poll results from last fall, and that's not really the case in terms of people do rank funding for public education really high as a priority, even people who are older than age 65. So we asked, how high a priority are certain issues for folks, and funding for pre-K through 12th grade, 75% of people said it was very important or fairly important, while only 64% said holding down taxes was as such. And of, broken down by age, people 65 and older, 65% said that funding for K through 12 education was a high priority. Now, getting to your point about people talking about school budgets as being the place where people come to vent their frustration at local property taxes. And we hear this all the time from school boards and city councils. I think the piece here, and this is what we're trying to do, is connect the system that you're operating in to the lack of funding from the state. So the reason that school budgets rely so heavily on local property taxes is because the state is not providing enough funding. That is the direct link there. And so I know that doesn't really solve it, like as you're writing a budget, as you're working on your school budget committee, but the reality is that you all are doing the best you can to operate in a system that the state is dramatically underfunding, to the tune of about $2.3 billion per year is being downshifted onto local property taxpayers to fund our public education system. And so I think, looking at it from having the state provide more funding should and could result in lower property taxes at the local level. And then all the kind of peripheral benefits, having access to an educated workforce is the workforce that's going to be taking care of folks as they're aging, and hopefully aging in their homes and in their communities, and are going to be the people working in jobs that are going to drive economic development in those communities so that they continue to be places of value and people can stay there. So there's all kind of related issues, even if you don't have students directly in the school system right now. But that property tax piece is, I think, making the link for folks that it's the state not providing enough funding that is directly causing the situation in which local property taxes need to be relied on so heavily for school district budgets.
So with regard to making it easier for young people to run for office, to Zach's point, and I know the questioner said beyond that, but I do think that it's important to do as much as we can to make it easier for young people to run for office, so that those voices and perspectives are heard. I mean, right now New Hampshire does have the oldest average legislature in the country, and there's a reason for that. All of you, I mean, none of you here, I'm sure, is running for the money, for that big $100 a year, right? You're not doing it for the money, and it's something that almost by nature, if you have a 9-to-5 job or a full-time job, it's almost impossible to serve in the legislature unless you have a very understanding employer, or you're independently wealthy, or have a job that kind of lends itself to that. So I think State Work Play has in the past supported legislation that works to make it easier. Things like areas, and we've seen some success with having areas for nursing mothers, to be able to nurse in the State House. There's talk about trying to do childcare for legislators who can bring their kids with them. One of the things we saw in the pandemic, and I think this is kind of a related aspect, but also working to make it easier for young people, if not to serve in the legislature, at least easier for them to get involved in the process and to be able to speak on bills, the pieces of legislation that affect them. And one of the things we saw, one of the silver linings of the pandemic, when the legislature went fully remote there for a session or so, is that we saw a lot greater participation, kind of writ large across the state, but particularly among younger working age people, that could they were working from home. They saw a bill hearing was coming up at 10:15 on a random Tuesday morning. Most people can't take off and drive to Concord from wherever they are in the state for that and sit around and wait. These things get backed up, as you know, and who knows how long it would take before your card is actually called to go up there and testify. But if they can be sitting there working on some other things, they hear their name called, they press unmute, say their piece. I think, things like that, to the extent we can bring back those opportunities to allow at least more younger people to weigh in on issues that affect them directly, whether it's school funding, whether it's housing, whether it's childcare, any of these things, that would be well served. Public policy in New Hampshire would be.
Great, thank you both. I have one more question for the panel before we wrap up. This is actually a question from the last webinar that we all did together, but I thought it was a good one to end on. So looking at the three main problems discussed tonight, it's hard to see how people keep talking about the New Hampshire advantage. Does the New Hampshire advantage really exist for us outside of low taxes for business owners?
I mean, I'm happy I can kick us off there. And I don't even remember what I said last time. So this would be a great, hopefully I'll do the same answer. I'll go back and look at the recording. Look, I mean, I think one of the main reasons why we all want to solve these problems, and part of the reason why they're growing, is because people do want to be here. As Zach hit on it, we do have great public schools, even though we fund them, in a pretty antiquated way. We have so many things that Will mentioned that people cited in their polls as why they want to be here. And clearly the demand is there on the housing side because we can't build fast enough for people to get here and move here. And so, we're talking about some challenges, and they're very real challenges and could absolutely shape who gets to live here and what kind of communities we can be in the future. But there is absolutely a reason why people come here and want to be here. And the data does bear that out, and that this is a desirable place to be. There is a great sense of community. You do have the White Mountains and the beaches, and then also access to cities around here. And so, we're talking about solving problems, but we're solving problems because people, want them solved because they want to continue to be here. And so, I would still say, who knows what the exact definition of that is, of the New Hampshire advantage, but, for a lot of us, something exists that keeps us here and wants us to be involved.
And I think that, to piggyback off Nick there, I think, the New Hampshire advantage, perhaps is in the eye of the beholder. I think it's traditionally taken to mean, a lack of, broad-based taxes, which, I mean, it's great. Yeah, you talk to anybody, hey, do you want to pay more taxes? Nobody's going to say, very few people, will say, yes, tax me more, but, I think a lot of people, would better define the New Hampshire advantage, those things that Nick mentioned, the things that our data suggest that people move here. And to me, what a great problem to have, because there are so many states, not just here in northern New England and across New England and across the country, where that's not the case. Right now we have people who want to be here. They're clamoring to be here. And we've seen the supply and demand issues with regard to housing, the great schools that Zach has talked about. I mean, we have a number of advantages, and we need the people. Again, our employers need employees, our towns need people to serve on planning boards and zoning boards, to run for the legislature, to run for town council. Our nonprofits, the Rotary clubs need members, the churches need people to pass the plate on Sunday. We need people. We don't have enough. So let's maintain that advantage and make it even easier, or I should say easier, for people of all ages. But from Stay Work Play's perspective, young people, we just need to make it easy for people to not only move here and get a toehold, but to thrive here. And if we can do that, I mean, the sky's the limit for New Hampshire.
Yeah, I very much agree with everything Nick and Will have said. And, I think you all being here and being interested in running for office and like the work that we do, like we're all examples of people that care deeply about this state and the ways we're working to make it, to continue to make it a place that people want to stay and live. Relative to the New Hampshire advantage, we talk about taxes, so I get that a lot. And I think from my perspective, the thing that really gets me is that we don't have low taxes, and the taxes that we do have really disproportionately affect people with less ability to pay. And so it looks like we don't have a lot of taxes because we don't have a broad-based sales or income tax. But when you start looking at the amount of the proportion of people's income that goes to taxes, specifically property taxes, people who make more than $600,000 pay about 2% of their income. People who make less than $75,000 pay about 6% of their income, 3 times as much. And so it's more that we have a tax structure that's very hidden and very baked into ways that are less easy to see right off the top, like an income tax. And that's something that we really try to highlight with focusing on the property taxes and showing how that is a compounding effect through economic development, through the ability of businesses to be there, through the funding for schools, because it's really kind of this hidden system. And it's not so much that we don't have taxes, it's just that who pays and how much they're paying is really inequitable across the state. So from my kind of like the New Hampshire Advantage tax perspective, that's kind of where my head goes. But then the flip side being, again, that we do have really good public schools. We have really good public teachers, administrators doing amazing work across the state. And, a lot of the data reflects that. It's just that the averages do hide some of those disparities, especially in some of our districts and our communities where we have higher proportion of students with need. And so I think it's just the kind of averages, surface level versus the getting into seeing who's actually impacted on a more granular level.
All right. Thanks, everyone. I guess I'll turn it over just to all of our panelists one more time to say a thank you and goodbye, and then we can close this out.
Yeah, thank you everybody for running, and good luck. And certainly if you have any questions, Casey dropped our contact info. Don't hesitate to reach out. We want to be helpful in this. We want to, anything we could do, we want to be there for you.
Ditto. Yeah, thank you all for taking the time to learn more about the issues and for running in the first place. And like Nick said, happy to talk one-on-one with anybody at any time.
Couldn't agree more with both of those. And we'll be sending out from Casey an email with the slides and the recording and our contact information again. And we hope that this will be the beginning of a relationship with all of you. If you win or not, through the session and for years to come as we work on these issues. So feel free to reach out. And thanks so much for coming tonight.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good night.